She smiled. I keep coming back to that. The moment the estate attorney cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and said my name, or rather, said that my name was not there, my grandmother smiled. Not a sad smile. Not an apologetic one. A composed, deliberate, almost surgical smile. The kind you rehearse in a mirror. The kind that tells you everything you did not want to know. Her trust attorney was already in the building. I did not find that out until later. At the time, I was sitting in a beige conference room in a law office in Scottsdale, Arizona, surrounded by relatives I barely recognized, and the faint smell of burnt coffee from a machine nobody had cleaned in months. My cousin Derek was on my left, picking at the armrest. My Aunt Patricia was on my right, wearing new earrings I had never seen before. Real ones. Diamond, I think. I remember thinking, when did she get those? My grandmother, Loretta May Whitfield, 81 years old, 5 feet 2 inches, the woman who used to iron her dish towels and refused to throw away a rubber band, sat at the head of that table like a queen who had already decided who would inherit the kingdom. And she had. She absolutely had. We just did not know it yet. I did not know it anyway. The others did. Let me tell you about Loretta, because if you only hear what she did, you will miss the full weight of it. And I need you to feel the full weight of it. My grandmother was not a warm woman in the conventional sense. She did not bake cookies and hug you at the door. She showed love through precision. She remembered every birthday without a calendar. She showed up to every single one of my school plays, even the embarrassing ones in 3rd grade where I played a talking carrot, with a handwritten card and a $20 bill folded into thirds. She called me every Sunday at 7 p.m. for 22 years. Every single Sunday. When my mother, her daughter, passed away from ovarian cancer in 2011, it was Loretta who moved into our house for 4 months. She slept on the pull-out couch in the living room and did not complain once. She made my father dinner every night. She washed the dishes before he even finished eating. She held the whole household together with quiet, bloodless efficiency while the rest of us were falling apart. I was 23 years old. I had just started my first real job at a dental office in Tempe. I was still paying off student loans, I was still learning how to be a functioning adult, and the woman who taught me how to be one, my mother, was gone. Loretta was the reason I did not completely unravel. After my father remarried in 2014, things shifted. He moved to Tucson with his new wife Karen, and I stayed in the Phoenix area, close enough to Loretta to see her regularly. Far enough from my father's new life to understand I did not exactly fit into it. Loretta and I became our own small unit. Every Thursday, I drove 45 minutes to her house in Scottsdale, and we had lunch. Turkey sandwiches, sweet tea, and whatever true crime documentary she had recorded on her DVR. She loved true crime. She had a steel trap memory for detail. She would pause the television and say things like, "That attorney is lying. Look at how he blinks when he says that." I should have paid more attention to that. Over the years, I helped her with the things she could not manage alone. I drove her to her cardiologist appointments. I helped her set up online banking when her old savings account got compromised. I organized her medical files. I fixed her cable when it went out. I painted her guest bathroom when the contractor she hired quoted her 4 times the reasonable rate. I did not do these things expecting anything in return. I want to be honest about that. Because it matters. I did them because she was the last real piece of my mother that I had left. And I was not ready to lose that. Here is what I also have to be honest about. I was lonely. I had been in and out of a long relationship that ended badly in 2018. No kids. A small apartment. A job I was good at, but did not love. Loretta was, in many ways, the most consistent relationship in my life. And I knew that. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, I leaned on that knowledge a little too hard. I assumed things. I assumed that consistency meant certainty. I assumed that 22 years of Sunday phone calls meant something permanent. That was my flaw. That is the thing I have to own. I assumed. Now, the family context. Loretta had 2 children. My mother, Christine, gone, and my uncle, Raymond. Raymond lived in Las Vegas and sold commercial real estate. He had made money, lost money, made it again in cycles that looked exhausting from the outside. He had a son named Derek, my cousin, who was 32 and worked loosely in marketing. And Raymond had a girlfriend named Pamela, whom I had met exactly 4 times in my life, who had the specific energy of a woman who had done a lot of research and very little of it was casual. Pamela smiled at you the way some people shake your hand, just slightly too long, just slightly too firm. She was always watching, always calculating. The first time she met Loretta, she spent 40 minutes looking at the artwork on the walls. Not admiring it, assessing it. I noticed that. I filed it away somewhere. And then I forgot about it. Because I trusted my grandmother. I trusted her completely. The changes started small. They always do. Around late 2020, Loretta mentioned, casually, over our Thursday lunch, that Raymond had been calling more often. She said it the way you mentioned the weather. Informational. Not significant. I was glad, honestly. Raymond had been distant for years, and their relationship had always been strained. I thought maybe the pandemic had reminded him to reconnect with family. That is what I told myself. By the spring of 2021, the Thursday lunches started shifting. Not cancelled, just rescheduled. Once a month, then once every 6 weeks. Loretta said she was tired. She said her knee was bothering her. She said she had a lot going on. I did not push. She was 80 years old. I was not going to interrogate her social calendar. But then, small things started not adding up. She mentioned a new financial advisor. She said Raymond had recommended him. She said the man was very sharp and had really helped her get things organized. I asked his name. She could not remember it exactly. She said something like Harrison or Henderson. I said I would be happy to look into him if she wanted a second opinion. She waved her hand at me and said, "You worry too much, sweetheart." She had never called me sweetheart before in my life. Loretta called people hon or baby or nothing at all. Sweetheart was not her word. I noticed that. I did not know what to do with it. Then, in August of 2021, I stopped by her house unannounced, which I had never done before. But her Sunday call had gone straight to voicemail, and I was worried. When I pulled up, Raymond's car was in the driveway. A rental. Nevada plates. And when Loretta answered the door, there was a brief flash of something in her face. Not quite panic. Not quite irritation. Before she arranged her expression into a smile and let me in. Raymond was at the kitchen table, with a man I had never seen before. Mid-50s, expensive watch, a leather portfolio open in front of him. There was a notary stamp on one of the documents I could partially see. When I walked in, the man closed the portfolio. Not hurriedly, calmly, but he closed it. Raymond stood up and hugged me. He smelled like airport bourbon. "Megan," he said, "we were just wrapping up some stuff for your grandmother. Estate planning. Boring legal stuff." He smiled. "You know how it is." I did not know how it was. I said so. I asked Loretta if she wanted me to look over anything. She shook her head. She said Raymond was taking good care of things. The man with the portfolio left 15 minutes later. Raymond left an hour after that. Loretta walked me to the door when I left and held my hand for just a moment longer than usual. She looked at me and said, "You are a good girl, Megan. You always have been." Past tense. That is what I thought in the car driving home. She said you always have been. Not you always are. Past tense. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I told myself I was paranoid. I told myself that Loretta was a competent woman who knew exactly what she was doing. I was right about that last part. She absolutely knew what she was doing. Be honest with me right now, because I genuinely want to know. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where something felt wrong, but you talked yourself out of it because you trusted the person too much to believe what you were seeing? Drop it in the comments. I think more people have been there than will ever admit it. Over the next several months, I kept noticing things, and then unnoticing them. That is the only way I know how to describe it. I would catch something, a changed routine, a new name I did not recognize, a phrase she used that did not sound like her, and then I would smooth it over in my mind. I would find an explanation. I was good at that. My grandmother's neighbor, a woman named Gloria, who had lived next door for 15 years, called me in January of 2022. She said she had seen a lot of coming and going at Loretta's house. Men in suits. Different cars. She said, "I did not want to be nosy, but it felt like a lot, Megan." I thanked her. I told her I would check in with Loretta. I did. Loretta told me Gloria was a busybody who needed a hobby. Loretta had said that about Gloria before. That part tracked, so I let it go. What I did not know What I could not have known without looking in places I did not think to look was that between August 2021 and March 2022, my grandmother had revised her estate trust. Twice, and not with her longtime estate attorney, a man named Gerald Fowler who had drafted her original documents in 2008 and who I had met on 3 separate occasions. No, she had a new attorney now. The one Raymond had recommended. The one with the portfolio and the expensive watch. His name, I eventually found out, was Richard Hensley. And Richard Hensley was not just Loretta's new estate attorney. He was also Raymond's business partner's brother-in-law. I know. The reading of Loretta May Whitfield's trust was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in April of 2022. It was one of those flat Arizona spring days where the sky is a perfect, indifferent blue and the heat has not yet turned cruel. I remember the drive over. A Tim McGraw song came on the radio, and I turned it off immediately because it felt too on the nose. I was already nervous in a way I could not fully explain to myself. I told myself it was grief. Loretta had passed 11 days earlier. A cardiac event in her sleep. Peaceful, the doctor said. I had been the one to find her when she did not answer her Sunday call for the 2nd week in a row. I had driven over. I had used my spare key. I will not describe what I found. Some things you do not put into words. Not because you cannot. Because some things deserve to stay private. So, I was grieving. And grieving people are nervous. That is what I told myself in the car. The law office was in a low building off Scottsdale Road. Neutral carpet, neutral walls, a watercolor print of the Sonoran Desert that nobody had looked at in years. The receptionist offered me coffee. I took it without tasting it. I sat down at the conference table. Derek was already there, scrolling his phone. Aunt Patricia arrived 4 minutes later with Raymond. They were laughing at something when they walked in. Laughing. 11 days after Loretta died, I watched them settle into their chairs, and I remember thinking, they are comfortable. They are too comfortable. Richard Hensley, the attorney with the expensive watch, was not in the room. Not yet. The estate attorney who conducted the reading was a younger associate named Brian Calloway. He had the careful, neutral energy of someone who had delivered bad news before and had learned to do it without flinching. He opened a folder. He explained the basic structure of the trust. He said that Loretta had made several amendments in the preceding 18 months. Several amendments. He cleared his throat. The primary residence in Scottsdale, valued at approximately $740,000, was to be transferred to Raymond Whitfield. The investment portfolio, approximately $310,000, was to be divided equally between Raymond Whitfield and Derek Whitfield. The personal property, jewelry, and household contents were to be managed at Raymond's discretion. There was a specific bequest of $15,000 to a charitable foundation I had never heard of. And there was a bequest of $8,500 to me. Megan Christine Harlow, her granddaughter. Named after her daughter. The woman who had driven 45 minutes every Thursday for 7 years, who had sat beside her at every cardiology appointment, who had held her hand in waiting rooms that smelled like antiseptic and forced optimism. $8,500. I looked up from the table. And that is when I saw it. That is when my grandmother, who was not physically in that room, but who felt, in that moment, very present, smiled at me through the architecture of every decision she had made in the last 18 months. I mean that Raymond smiled. He had her exact smile. The composed one. The surgical one. Patricia reached over and touched his arm. Derek put his phone down. Brian Calloway closed the folder with the quiet precision of a man who was paid to be somewhere else now. I did not cry. I want to say that clearly. I did not cry in that room. I held the coffee cup, still warm, still untasted, and I looked at the watercolor print of the desert, and I breathed. And somewhere underneath the grief and the shock and the specific humiliation of being handed $8,500 after 7 years of Thursdays, something else was waking up. Something cold. Something patient. Something that wanted to understand exactly what had happened. Not to feel it. To understand it. If you have ever been overlooked by someone you gave everything to, and I mean everything, you know exactly what that moment feels like. It is not loud. It is very, very quiet. If that resonates with you, stick around, because what came next is the part that changed everything. I went home that Tuesday, and I sat on my kitchen floor. I do not know why the floor specifically. I had a couch. I had a perfectly reasonable chair. But the floor felt right. The linoleum was cold, and the refrigerator was humming that low, constant hum it always does, and I sat there with my back against the cabinet under the sink, and I just stayed there for a while. I did not spiral. I want to be precise about this. What I did instead was something that surprised me about myself. I made a list, not of grievances, of questions. Question 1. When, specifically, did the trust get amended? Brian Calloway had said the preceding 18 months. That put the window starting around October of 2020, right around the time Raymond started calling more frequently. Question 2. Who was Richard Hensley, exactly, and what was his relationship to Raymond? Question 3. What happened to Loretta's relationship with her original attorney, Gerald Fowler? He had drafted her documents in 2008. She had trusted him for over a decade. Why did she switch? Question 4. The charitable foundation that received $15,000. I had never heard of it. Loretta had not, to my knowledge, been involved in charitable giving beyond her church. What was it? Question 5, and this one took me a long time to write down, because writing it made it real. Was my grandmother a willing participant in this? Or had something been done to her? That question is the one that kept me up at night. Because the answer, the honest, complicated answer, turned out to be both. And neither. And I still do not fully know how to carry that. But I am getting ahead of myself. I started with what I could access. Public records. Arizona has relatively open probate and property records, which meant that once the trust transferred into Raymond's name, certain filings became visible. I am not an attorney. I am not an investigator. I am a woman who managed a dental office for 8 years and became very, very good at finding things that had been misfiled. The first thing I found was the deed transfer on Loretta's Scottsdale property. It had been pre-filed. Not after she died. Before. A transfer on death deed, signed and notarized in September of 2021. The same month I had walked into her kitchen and found the man with the portfolio. He had not been there to finalize something. He had been there to execute something that was already decided. I sat with that for a moment. The smell of burnt coffee from my own kitchen. The refrigerator hum. The specific way a betrayal lands when it stops being a feeling and becomes a document. Next, Richard Hensley. His bar listing in Arizona was legitimate, licensed since 2004. No disciplinary actions. His listed specialties were estate planning and business law. His firm was small, 3 attorneys. And when I cross-referenced his firm's name against Raymond's business filings, Raymond had an LLC registered in Nevada. I found it. Not a direct connection. One step removed. Hensley's firm had provided legal services to a company called Sunstate Capital Partners. Sunstate Capital Partners had, in 2019, co-invested in a commercial property deal with Raymond's LLC. 1 degree of separation. That is all it was. But it was enough. It meant that Richard Hensley was not a neutral third party who happened to specialize in estate law. He was a man with a pre-existing financial relationship with my uncle. A man Raymond had placed in front of an 80-year-old woman who was, by that point in her life, increasingly reliant on Raymond for information about what she should do and who she should trust. Now, here is where I have to be honest again, because honesty is the only thing that makes this story worth telling. Loretta was not incompetent. She was not diagnosed with dementia. She was not, in any clinical sense, incapacitated. She was a sharp woman who had lived 81 years on her own terms and had made a decision, a real, considered decision, to restructure her estate. Some of what happened to her was done to her, and some of it she chose. What I believe, and what the evidence I eventually gathered suggested, is that Raymond spent approximately 18 months carefully managing what information Loretta received, what fears he amplified, and what version of family loyalty he sold her. He did not forge documents. He did not steal. He worked within the system. He just made sure the system was staffed with people who were already on his side before Loretta ever walked into the room. That is not illegal, not technically. But it is something. The charitable foundation, the one that received the $15,000, was called the Sonoran Heritage Fund. I looked it up. It was a registered 501c3, which gave it a layer of legitimacy. It had been incorporated in 2019. Its listed board of directors included 3 names I did not recognize, and 1 name I did. Pamela, Raymond's girlfriend, the one with the watchful eyes and the new earrings. Pamela Driscoll was listed as treasurer of the Sonoran Heritage Fund, so the charitable bequest in my grandmother's will, the one that was presented as a generous final act of philanthropy, went to a foundation where Raymond's girlfriend controlled the money. I printed that page. I put it in a folder. I labeled the folder with a piece of masking tape, the way Loretta herself had taught me to organize things. Precise. Methodical. 1 document at a time. And then, I called Gerald Fowler, the original attorney, the one Loretta had used for 14 years before Raymond introduced her to Richard Hensley. Gerald Fowler was 70 years old and semi-retired. He answered his own phone. When I told him who I was, there was a pause on the line. Not an awkward pause, a deliberate one. He said, "Megan, I was wondering if someone would call." He had been replaced. He knew it. He had not fought it. He said he had no legal standing to, but he had not been comfortable with it either. He told me that in early 2021, Loretta had called him and said she was making some changes and would be working with a new attorney going forward. He said she sounded fine on the phone. Clear. Calm. But he said there was something in how she phrased things that did not sound entirely like her. Like she was reading from notes. Like someone had given her the language. He said, "I almost called you then." I should have. I told him not to carry that. I meant it. Because by then I understood. This had been constructed carefully. Anyone who might have raised the flag had been quietly moved out of position before they had reason to raise one. Gerald Fowler had one more thing for me. He said that in 2019, before any of the trust amendments, before Richard Hensley, Loretta had spoken to him about updating her documents. She had told him at that time, explicitly, that she wanted to make sure Megan is taken care of. He had notes from that conversation. He offered to send them to me. I said yes, please. I hung up, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Walgreens on Indian School Road for about 20 minutes. The air conditioning was on too high. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. My hands were perfectly still. Because I was not angry anymore. Anger had passed through me somewhere around the 2nd week and come out the other side as something more useful. I had a folder. I had records. I had a witness. I had a financial connection between the attorney and the beneficiary that predated the trust amendments by years. And I had a handwritten note from Gerald Fowler's 2019 file that said, in Loretta's own words, that she wanted to make sure I was taken care of. What I did not have was a lawyer. Not yet. I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. If you found out that someone had spent 18 months quietly engineering your exclusion from your own family, legally, carefully, without a single forged signature, what would you do? I genuinely want to know what you would do. Tell me in the comments. Because what I did next is something I am still not entirely sure I am proud of. Finding the right attorney took 3 weeks. Not because there were not options. Because I needed someone who understood the specific intersection of estate law, undue influence claims, and the kind of circumstantial evidence I had, which was, on its own, compelling, but not yet airtight. Undue influence. That is the legal term. It means that a person in a position of trust, a family member, a caregiver, an advisor, uses that position to override the free will of the person making the legal decisions. It does not require fraud. It does not require forgery. It requires demonstrating that the testator, in this case Loretta, was susceptible to influence, that the influencer had the opportunity to exert it, and that the result of the documents reflects the influencer's desires rather than the testator's own. My attorney's name was Sandra Okafor. She was 44 years old, practiced in Phoenix, and had a reputation, which I verified before I called her, for taking on exactly these kinds of cases. Cases where the wrongdoing was structural rather than explicit. Cases where the damage was real, but the paperwork was clean. When I laid everything out on the table in her office, she did not react with alarm or excitement. She listened. She took notes. When I finished, She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Tell me about the Sun State Capital Partners connection again. Walk me through how you found it." I walked her through it. She wrote something down and circled it twice. She said the case was not certain. She said undue influence cases are difficult. She said we would need more than a financial connection, we would need a pattern. Behavioral evidence. Witnesses who could speak to Loretta's state of mind during the period of the amendments. Medical records, if her physician was willing to cooperate. And we would need to move relatively quickly, because the state challenges have filing deadlines in Arizona. I asked her what she needed me to do. She said, "Keep building the file, and do not contact Raymond." I had not contacted Raymond since the will reading. He had sent me a brief text 5 days afterward that said, "Hope you are doing okay, Megan. Mom loved you very much." I had read it and put my phone face down on the counter and left it there for 2 days. I did not respond. Not because I did not want to, because Sandra Okafor had not told me I could yet. And at that point, I was not operating on feeling anymore. I was operating on process. Over the following 6 weeks, I built the file. I contacted Loretta's cardiologist's office, a Dr. Namdi Eze, and requested her medical records under my status as a named individual in the estate. Her records showed that between 2020 and 2022, she had been prescribed a mild anti-anxiety medication that had not previously been part of her regimen. The prescribing notes referenced increased family stresses and difficulty making decisions independently. Those were not my words. Those were in the chart. I contacted Gloria, the neighbor. She was willing to provide a written statement. She described 4 separate occasions between 2021 and 2022 where she had seen Raymond at the house, sometimes with other individuals, on days that did not correspond to holidays or known family visits. She described one occasion where she had seen Loretta standing at the front window after a group of men left, and the word Gloria used, unprompted, in her own written statement, was lost. She said Loretta looked lost. I found 2 more things that I did not expect. The first was a text thread on Loretta's old iPad, which I had in my possession because she had asked me to help her with it 2 years earlier and had never asked for it back. I had not looked at it after she died. I did not feel right about it. But Sandra said it was relevant and potentially admissible. And so I looked. There were messages between Loretta and Raymond from the fall of 2021. In one exchange, Raymond had written, "You know Christine would have wanted this. She would have wanted the family to be protected." Christine. My mother. He used my dead mother's name to tell his own mother how to rewrite her will. The second thing I found was a voicemail, still saved on her landline's answering machine, the old physical kind, the one she refused to replace because she said she could always find the button. It was from October 2021. Raymond's voice. And he was not threatening her. He was not yelling. He was calm and warm and persuasive, the way a man sounds when he has practiced what he wants to say. He talked about the future, about protecting what Loretta had built, about making sure it stayed in the family. And at the end, at the very end, he said, "And Megan is young. She will be fine. You do not need to worry about Megan. You do not need to worry about Megan." I listened to that voicemail 4 times. Then I called Sandra Okafor and told her what I had. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Save everything. Do not delete anything. And clear your schedule for next Thursday." Sandra Okafor filed the petition on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because that was the day I used to drive 45 minutes to have turkey sandwiches with my grandmother. The day had been empty since April. I had not known what to do with Thursdays for 2 months. And then Sandra called me at 9:14 in the morning and said, "It is filed." And suddenly, Thursday had a new shape. The petition alleged undue influence in the execution of Loretta Mae Whitfield's amended trust documents. It named Raymond Whitfield as the primary influencing party. It named Richard Hensley as a material witness with a disclosed conflict of interest. It cited the Sun State Capital Partners connection. It cited the medical records. It cited Gerald Fowler's testimony. It cited the voicemail. That voicemail, saved on a plastic answering machine that Loretta refused to replace because she could always find the button. Sandra had also filed a motion to compel the production of all communications between Raymond Whitfield and Richard Hensley dating back to 2019. All of them. Every email. Every text. Every billed hour. Raymond was served 3 days later at his home in Las Vegas. I was not there for that, obviously. But I have thought about it many times. I have thought about the moment a process server knocked on the door of his house, which was, I later learned, a very nice house in a gated community in Henderson, Nevada, with a 3-car garage and a pool, and handed him a document that contained the words undue influence and conflict of interest and Richard Hensley in the same paragraph. I have thought about what his face did in that moment. I hope it was the opposite of composed. His attorney, a different attorney, not Hensley, notably, contacted Sandra within 48 hours. The tone of that initial communication, Sandra told me later, was dismissive. They characterized the petition as emotionally motivated and lacking evidentiary foundation. They called my grandmother's amended documents the clear and considered expression of her final wishes. They suggested I was a grieving relative who had misinterpreted ordinary estate planning as something sinister. Sandra read me that letter over the phone. When she finished, she said, "Good. They are not taking it seriously yet. That is exactly where we want them." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Overconfident opposing counsel makes mistakes in discovery. Let them underestimate us for now." I had hired the right person. Discovery is not dramatic. I want to be honest about that, because every documentary and every legal thriller wants you to believe that the truth arrives in a single stunning moment, a document slapped on a table, a witness who breaks on the stand. That is not how it actually works. What actually happens is boxes, emails printed and numbered, spreadsheets, hours of reading billing records that are deliberately formatted to be as dense and illegible as possible. Sandra had a paralegal named Marcus, who I spoke with more than I spoke with my own friends during those 4 months. Marcus was methodical and unhurried, and he found things the way a person finds a splinter, by pressing carefully in the right place until something gives. What gave first was the billing records. Richard Hensley's firm had billed Loretta's estate for 43 separate consultations between August 2021 and March 2022. 43. For an 81-year-old woman whose estate, while substantial, was not complex. A house, an investment account, some personal property. 43 consultations in 8 months is not estate planning. That is management. That is maintenance. That is someone making sure a set of decisions stays decided. Marcus cross-referenced the dates of those consultations against Raymond's travel records, which we obtained through a separate request, and found that Raymond had been physically present in the Phoenix area on 31 of those 43 billed dates. 31. He had flown in from Las Vegas 31 times in 8 months, on his own dime, to help his elderly mother with her estate planning. Or so the story went. The emails told a different story. The compelled communications between Raymond and Hensley, the one Sandra had filed the motion to obtain, took 6 weeks and a judge's order to actually produce. When they arrived, they were 340 pages. Marcus went through all of them. I went through all of them. We went through them separately, and then compared notes, the way you read a contract when the stakes are high enough that you cannot trust a single pair of eyes. There was an email from Raymond to Hensley, dated September 4th, 2021. 4 days before the transfer on death deed was signed and notarized. The email was about the deed. It was about the specific language of the deed. And it contained a sentence that Sandra highlighted in yellow and texted me a photo of at 11:30 at night, with no additional comment. The sentence was, "She is agreeable, but she asks about Megan. Handle that when you meet with her tomorrow." She is agreeable, but she asks about Megan. Handle that. My grandmother had asked about me. In the room with the notary and the portfolio and the expensive watch, she had asked about me. And Richard Hensley had been sent in specifically prepared to handle that, to redirect it, to smooth it over, to give her whatever answer made her stop asking. I sat with my phone in my hand in my apartment at 11:30 at night, and I read that sentence 8 times. The refrigerator hummed, a car went past outside, and I thought about Loretta holding my hand at the door the day I walked in on them and saying, "You are a good girl, Megan. You always have been." She was saying goodbye. She was saying goodbye, and she knew it, and she did it anyway. And I still cannot decide, even now, what to do with that. But I had what Sandra needed. That email. She is agreeable, but she asks about Megan. Handle that, was the turning point. Because it demonstrated, in Raymond's own words, that Loretta had reservations, that she had expressed specific concern about my exclusion, and that Raymond had actively worked to suppress and redirect that concern before the documents were signed. That is not estate planning. That is engineering. If this story is making you feel something right now, if it is making you want to call someone you love or question something you have been ignoring, then you already understand why I share these stories. There are people in your life who need to hear this. If you know someone going through something like this, send this to them. You might be the reason they start asking the right questions. Raymond's attorney stopped being dismissive in week 9. That was when Sandra received a call asking whether her client would be open to a preliminary conversation about resolution. That is attorney language for, "We have read the emails, and we would like this to stop going where it is going." Sandra called me and asked how I wanted to proceed. She laid out the options without editorializing, the way a good attorney does. We could continue toward trial, which would be expensive, slow, and uncertain, but which would put everything on the public record. Or we could negotiate a settlement, which would likely result in a larger financial outcome for me, but would keep the details private and would not result in any formal finding of wrongdoing against Raymond or Hensley. She said, "What matters most to you, the money or the record?" I thought about that for a long time, longer than she probably expected. What I wanted, the thing I actually wanted, underneath everything, was for someone official and credentialed to say out loud that what Raymond had done was wrong. I wanted a document with a judge's signature on it that said, "This woman was manipulated. This woman's wishes were redirected. This woman asked about her granddaughter, and someone was sent to handle that." But I also understood something that took me a while to admit. A trial would take 18 months minimum. It would cost more money than I had. It would require me to sit across a table from Raymond in a courtroom and watch his attorney explain to a judge why my grandmother's love for me was not as substantial as I believed. And at the end of it, I might still lose. Undue influence cases are difficult. Sandra had said that from the beginning. The law is built to protect the finality of estate documents, not to second-guess them. So I made a decision. Not the heroic one, the practical one. I told Sandra I would negotiate. But I gave her 3 conditions that were not negotiable. 1. The settlement amount had to reflect what I would have received under the original 2019 trust structure that Gerald Fowler had described. The one where Loretta had explicitly said she wanted to make sure I was taken care of. Sandra estimated that figure, based on the asset values and the language Fowler recalled, at somewhere between $180,000 and $220,000. 2. Richard Hensley had to be reported to the Arizona State Bar. I would not file the complaint myself. That was not within my power to compel through settlement. But I wanted it on the record, in our negotiation, that Sandra was prepared to file a separate bar complaint based on the conflict of interest documentation, independent of the civil case. That was a real threat. A disclosed conflict of interest between an estate attorney and the primary beneficiary, evidenced by financial records and direct email communication, is exactly the kind of thing bar committees examine carefully. 3. Raymond had to send me something in writing acknowledging that Loretta cared about me. Not an apology. Not an admission. Just that. Just those words. Sandra looked at me when I said that 3rd condition. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That one might be the hardest to get." It was. It took 4 separate rounds of negotiation. Raymond's attorney pushed back on it every time. Raymond was willing to write a check. He was not willing to write a sentence. And that told me everything I needed to know about him. A man who would spend 8 months engineering his mother's estate and could not find it in himself to write 1 sentence acknowledging that she loved her granddaughter. Not because it would cost him anything legally, because it would cost him something else. Something he had decided he did not owe me. He wrote it in the end. 2 sentences. Loretta Whitfield cared deeply for her family, including her granddaughter Megan. It is our hope that this resolution honors her memory. It is carefully worded. It says nothing and everything simultaneously. But it exists. It is signed. It is in a folder with a piece of masking tape on it, labeled the way Loretta taught me to label things. I keep it. The settlement was finalized in February of 2023. The amount was $195,000. It came with a confidentiality clause. which means there are specific things I cannot say about the specific numbers in the specific documents. What I have told you is what I am able to tell you. The shape of it. The architecture. The email that said, handle that. Richard Hensley did receive a bar complaint. Sandra filed it independently, as she had indicated she was prepared to do. I do not know the outcome of that process. Bar proceedings are not public in Arizona until a final decision is issued, and as of the time I am telling you this, I have not received any notification. These things take time. Sometimes they take years. Sometimes they result in nothing. I have made my peace with not controlling that outcome. Raymond sold the Scottsdale house 8 months after Loretta died. He listed it at $795,000. It sold in 11 days. He and Pamela were photographed at what I can only describe as a celebratory dinner in Las Vegas, the week the sale closed. I know because Derek, my cousin Derek, who had sat on my left at the will reading, picking at the armrest, sent me the photo. Without comment. Just the photo. Derek and I have not spoken since. I do not know what to do with him. He was not the architect of any of this. But he sat in that room and he knew the shape of what was coming, and he said nothing. Sometimes, knowing and saying nothing is its own kind of choice. I have not found the right framework for that yet. My father, who had been largely absent from all of this, absorbed in his life in Tucson, called me when the settlement was finalized. He said he was glad I had fought for myself. He said he wished he had paid more attention. He said he thought about Loretta all the time. I believed him. I also understood that believing him and needing more from him are two things that can exist at the same time without canceling each other out. Here is the thing about winning something like this, and I use the word winning carefully, because it does not feel the way winning is supposed to feel. It does not feel clean. There is no moment where the credits roll and the music swells and you walk away feeling like justice has a shape that fits neatly in your hands. What you get instead is a folder. A check that arrived by wire transfer on a Tuesday afternoon while you were at work. A 2-sentence letter that took 4 rounds of negotiation. And a grandmother you cannot call anymore to tell any of it to. That last part is the part nobody warns you about. The victory loops back around to the loss, every time, without exception. I won something on behalf of a relationship that no longer exists to receive the news. And Loretta, wherever she is, whatever she knew, whatever she chose, whatever was done to her in the space between knowing and choosing, she does not get to know that I fought. Or maybe she does. I have been going back and forth on that for over a year. Here is what I have decided. For now. My grandmother was a complicated woman. She was not a perfect victim. She was not entirely manipulated. She made real choices under circumstances that were carefully constructed to narrow her options. And she made some of those choices willingly, and some of them while someone was in the room telling her not to worry about Megan. I can hold both of those things. I have to hold both of those things, because only holding one of them would be a lie. What I know for certain, the only thing I know without a single reservation, is the phone call on Sunday evenings at 7 p.m. For 22 years. I know the $20 bills folded into thirds. I know the pull-out couch in our living room, and the dishes washed before my father finished eating, and the true crime documentaries on the DVR, and the way she said, "You worry too much, sweetheart," and I did not recognize that it sounded like goodbye. I know she asked about me. I know someone was sent to handle that. And I know it did not fully work. Because she held my hand at the door, just a little longer than usual, and she told me I was a good girl. Past tense. Present truth. She asked about me. Even at the end, in that room, under all of it, she asked about me. I am going to keep that. They can have the house. They can have the portfolio. They can have whatever they built in those 18 months with their careful language and their expensive watches and their pre-filed deeds. She asked about me. And nobody, not Raymond, not Richard Hensley, not a single document with a notary stamp, can handle that away. I really want to know, and I mean this genuinely. Would you have forgiven her? My grandmother. Not Raymond. Her, the woman who held my hand at the door and still signed the papers. I have been sitting with that question for over a year, and I still do not have a clean answer. Tell me what you think in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you think about someone in your own life, or something you have been leaving unexamined, then you might want to stick around. Because stories like this are the reason this channel exists. Every single one of them. Thank you for being here for all 3 parts. If you watched from the beginning, you already know this was not a simple story. It was never going to be. The real ones never are. If someone in your life needs to hear this, someone dealing with a family estate situation, someone who has been quietly pushed to the edges of something that should have included them, send it to them. Sometimes the most useful thing is just knowing you are not the only one who has sat on a kitchen floor making a list of questions instead of falling apart. I will see you in the next one.